Betty Crocker fed an entire nation and then erased 30 of her own recipes without a single word of explanation. These dishes do not appear in any modern cookbook. They are not on any website. General Mills buried them. Number 15 on this list is so very antique that even professional culinary historians cannot locate its original source. Tonight they come back. Part 1. Eggs à la goldenrod. Before the scrambled egg became the default American breakfast, Betty Crocker taught an entirely different method, one that transformed the humble egg into something that looked like it belonged on a hotel dining table. Eggs à la goldenrod appeared in the original 1950 Betty Crocker picture cookbook, and home economics teachers across the country used it as the very first recipe they taught young women in school classrooms. The process was deliberate and precise. Hard-cooked eggs were separated by hand, whites chopped fine, yolks pressed through a sieve until they fell like golden dust over everything below. A thick white cream sauce was prepared separately, poured hot over buttered toast cut into perfect triangular points, and then that shower of crumbled golden yolk was scattered across the top like fine powder. The dish looked expensive. It looked trained. It looked like something a professional cook had assembled. But every ingredient cost almost nothing. That was the quiet genius of Betty Crocker. She understood that dignity at the dinner table did not require money. It only required knowledge. And that knowledge has now been completely forgotten. Part 2. Chicken à la king. In 1950, if an American family wanted to signal that dinner was special, that tonight was not an ordinary weeknight, they made chicken à la king. This dish carried an almost aristocratic reputation in mid-century households, despite being built from leftovers. Betty Crocker's version appeared prominently in her picture cookbook, and it became the standard by which all other creamed dishes were measured. Cooked chicken, pulled from yesterday's roasted bird, was folded into a rich sauce made from butter, flour, cream, and chicken broth, then combined with sautéed mushrooms, diced pimentos, and tender green pepper strips. It was served over toast points, over rice, or spooned into baked pastry shells for company dinners. The dish had origins tracing back to the late 1890s, with culinary historians debating whether it was first created at the Brighton Beach Hotel in New York or at Delmonico's restaurant. Betty Crocker democratized it entirely. She took a dish that once existed only in fine dining rooms and placed it inside the weeknight kitchen of every working household in America. Today, almost nobody under the age of 60 has ever tasted it. Part 3. Welsh Rarebit. Welsh rarebit has one of the most peculiar names in the entire history of American cooking, and Betty Crocker refused to let it disappear without a fight. The dish appears in multiple editions of her cookbooks, recommended as a quick supper, a late-night meal, and a sophisticated alternative to the plain grilled cheese. Despite the word rarebit suggesting some kind of game meat, there is no rabbit anywhere in this recipe. The name itself is believed to be an 18th-century British joke, a mocking reference to Welsh poverty, implying that melted cheese on bread was the closest a Welsh family could get to actual meat on the table. Betty Crocker's version called for sharp cheddar cheese melted slowly with butter, dry mustard, Worcestershire sauce, and either ale or milk, depending on the household. The result was a thick, glossy, deeply savory sauce poured hot over toasted bread. It was served immediately, steaming at the table. Grace Huang Lynch, writing about her family's copy of Betty Crocker's new picture cookbook, recalled her mother lingering over this very recipe with quiet curiosity, wondering how people once found such satisfaction in something this simple. Now that satisfaction is gone entirely. Part 4. Chicken tetrazzini. Chicken tetrazzini was named after Luisa Tetrazzini, one of the most celebrated opera singers in the world at the turn of the 20th century. The dish was reportedly created in her honor by a San Francisco chef around 1908, a combination of pasta, cream sauce, sherry, and chicken so rich and generous that it matched her legendary reputation for abundance. Betty Crocker adopted it, refined it, and placed it directly into the American household kitchen. Her version used thin spaghetti, cooked chicken, sautéed mushrooms, and a cream sauce fortified with Parmesan cheese, all baked together in a casserole dish until the top turned golden and the edges began to bubble. It was a dish built for a crowd, for church potlucks, for neighborhood gatherings, for the kind of dinner where 12 people needed to be fed from a single pan. Reviewers of Betty Crocker's Lost Recipes specifically called it out as one of the most memorable dishes in the collection. And yet, somewhere between the pasta revolution of the 1980s and the rise of Italian restaurant culture, chicken tetrazzini simply stopped appearing on American tables. The opera singer is remembered. Her dish is not. Part 5. Perfection Salad. Perfection Salad won a recipe contest in 1905, and that victory changed the way Americans thought about salad for the next 50 years. The original recipe was submitted by Mrs. John E. Cook of New Castle, Pennsylvania to a competition run by Knox Gelatin, and it earned her a sewing machine as the prize. Betty Crocker later adopted and popularized the recipe across multiple cookbook editions. The dish was a molded gelatin salad, lemon-flavored gelatin packed with shredded cabbage, celery, pimentos, and pickles, then chilled until firm in a decorative mold and unmolded onto a plate for serving. It looked architectural. It looked intentional. In the 1950s, serving a molded gelatin salad was considered the mark of a capable, organized hostess. It required advanced planning, patience, and precision. Home economics textbooks cited perfection salad as a model recipe for teaching young women proper technique. Writers who examined Betty Crocker's vintage picture cookbook noted the gelatin salad sections with equal parts fascination and disbelief, unable to fully understand how an entire generation found this combination of textures not only acceptable but genuinely appealing. Today it reads as strange. In 1955, it read as perfection. Part 6. Pacific Lime Mold. The Pacific Lime mold represents a very specific moment in American food history, the moment when processed convenience and homemade cooking collided inside a single glass bowl. Betty Crocker's 1954 Good and Easy Cookbook included this recipe as a practical, budget-friendly dish that could be assembled quickly and chilled overnight for the following day's lunch or dinner. The base was lime-flavored gelatin, dissolved in boiling water and left to cool until just slightly thickened. Into that thickening mold went cottage cheese, creamy, mild, and protein-rich, along with crushed pineapple and a sharp measure of prepared horseradish. The contrast was intentional. Sweet fruit against tangy dairy against the aggressive bite of horseradish, all suspended in a trembling lime green gelatin shell. When sliced at the table, it revealed a speckled interior that looked almost decorative. Food historians writing about mid-century American cooking describe the Pacific Lime mold as a perfect artifact of its era, a time when refrigeration was still relatively new to many households, when Jell-O carried genuine status as a modern food technology, and when the line between salad, side dish, and dessert was deliberately blurred. That line no longer exists. Part 7. Cherry Olive Gelatin Salad. Of all the recipes Betty Crocker placed inside her vintage cookbook collections, the cherry olive gelatin salad may be the one that modern readers find most difficult to understand. The recipe appeared in her step-by-step recipe card series from the mid-1970s and called for cherry-flavored gelatin, the same sweet, bright red gelatin associated with children's desserts, combined with canned dark sweet cherries, chopped walnuts, and sliced pimiento-stuffed green olives. The sweetness of the cherry gelatin met the briny sharpness of the olive in a combination that was not accidental. Mid-century American cooking regularly embraced sweet and savory contrasts in ways that the modern palate no longer recognizes as traditional. The dish was poured into individual molds, chilled for 3 hours until fully firm, then unmolded onto beds of salad greens and served as a first course at dinner parties. Betty Crocker's recipe notes specified that the mold could be prepared up to 24 hours in advance, making it ideal for the organized hostess planning a large gathering. The combination of flavors seems jarring today. But in 1965, it was considered refined, elegant, and impressively modern. Part 8. Daiquiri Fruit Mold. The daiquiri fruit mold was Betty Crocker's most sophisticated gelatin recipe, and it was built for the dinner party table, not the everyday family supper. The recipe called for a rum and lime-flavored gelatin base, poured into a 5-cup decorative mold and filled with fresh melon balls, then chilled for a minimum of 3 hours until completely firm. When unmolded onto a serving platter and garnished at the table, it carried the appearance of something far more complicated than it actually was. The name alone, daiquiri, carried social weight in the 1950s and 1960s. It signaled cocktail culture, leisure, and a certain level of worldliness. Betty Crocker's recipe notes confirmed that the mold could be held in the refrigerator for up to 24 hours, which made it the perfect advanced preparation dish for a hostess managing multiple courses simultaneously. Food writers examining vintage Betty Crocker cards describe the daiquiri fruit mold as a bridge between the cocktail hour and the dinner table, a dish designed to impress guests before a single hot course had been served. The melons sat suspended inside the gelatin like specimens in a laboratory. Guests were supposed to be charmed. Most of them were. Part 9. Creamed salmon on biscuits. Long before canned tuna became the default pantry protein of the American household, canned salmon held that position, and Betty Crocker built an entire category of weeknight dinners around it. Creamed salmon on biscuits appeared in multiple early editions of her cookbook as a practical, fast, and filling supper that required almost no fresh ingredients. Red salmon was drained, flaked carefully to remove skin and bones, and folded into a thick cream sauce seasoned with salt, pepper, and a small measure of lemon juice. That cream was ladled hot over split, freshly baked baking powder biscuits, golden, flaky, and still steaming from the oven. The combination was deeply satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with sophistication and everything to do with warmth. Canned salmon was one of the most economical proteins available to American families in the 1940s and 1950s, and Betty Crocker treated it with complete seriousness, developing multiple recipes that elevated it far beyond the can it came from. Food historians trace the decline of creamed salmon dishes directly to the rise of the tuna melt in the 1960s, when canned tuna overtook salmon as the preferred pantry fish. The biscuits remained. The salmon did not. Part 10. Salmon loaf with cream of shrimp sauce. The salmon loaf represented something very important in mid-century American domestic cooking. It represented the art of transformation. A housewife who could take 2 cans of red salmon, combine them with breadcrumbs, egg, chopped onion, and seasoning, shape the mixture into a firm loaf, and bake it until it sliced cleanly at the table had demonstrated real kitchen competence. Betty Crocker's version added an extraordinary finishing element, a warm sauce made from condensed cream of shrimp soup, milk, sliced pimiento stuffed olives, and frozen green peas, poured over each serving at the table. The sauce turned a humble fish loaf into something that looked genuinely considered. The recipe appeared in Betty Crocker's step-by-step card collection and instructed cooks to serve the loaf on toasted bread slices spread with butter and prepared mustard, creating a layered construction that was simultaneously a sandwich and a main course. Canned salmon in the 1950s came from Pacific Northwest fisheries and was considered a quality protein. The condensed shrimp soup, introduced by Campbell's in the mid-20th century, has itself since been discontinued, making this recipe doubly impossible to recreate in its original form today. Part 11. Turkey bake with mushroom corn sauce. After Thanksgiving in mid-century America, the leftover turkey problem was real, and Betty Crocker solved it with a recipe that turned cold roasted bird into a structured, baked main course worthy of a second dinner. The turkey bake appeared in her step-by-step recipe card collection and approached the leftover question with genuine ingenuity. Cut-up cooked turkey was arranged in a greased baking pan. A mixture of beaten eggs, warm water, and packaged turkey gravy mix was poured directly over the pieces, allowing the liquid to settle around and beneath the meat. The top was then covered with herb-seasoned stuffing mix and a scattering of slivered almonds, creating a layered crust that baked golden in a 350-degree oven for 40 minutes. Each serving was finished with a warm mushroom corn sauce, condensed cream of mushroom soup combined with canned whole kernel corn with sweet peppers and a full can of mushroom stems and pieces. The result was a dish that felt abundant, considered, and completely new, despite being built entirely from what remained after the holiday. Betty Crocker understood that resourcefulness and generosity were not opposites. They were the same instinct. Part 12. Stuffed mushroom caps. In the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, the stuffed mushroom cap occupied a very specific place in American social life. It was the appetizer that announced a hostess had made an effort. Betty Crocker featured stuffed mushroom caps in her Lost Recipes collection as one of the definitive party starters of the mid-century era, and the recipe reflected the care that went into pre-dinner entertaining at the time. Large mushroom caps were cleaned, stems removed and chopped fine, then combined with breadcrumbs, butter, garlic, fresh parsley, and grated Parmesan cheese to create a dense, fragrant filling. Each cap was mounded generously, arranged on a baking sheet, and roasted until the filling turned deep golden and the mushroom beneath had softened and released its juices. They were served hot, directly from the oven, on small plates or passed around on trays. Reviewers of the Betty Crocker Lost Recipes archive specifically identified the stuffed mushroom caps as a dish they remembered being served at family gatherings throughout the 1960s, present at almost every holiday table and neighborhood party of that decade. The recipe never disappeared from cooking entirely, but the ritual of making it from scratch, filling each cap by hand, arranging them in neat rows, that ritual is gone. Part 13. Pigs in a Blanket, 1950s Cocktail Style. The version of Pigs in a Blanket that Betty Crocker documented in the 1950s bears almost no resemblance to the frozen supermarket product that carries that name today. In mid-century American cocktail party culture, a culture that Betty Crocker actively supported and helped script, these were small, precise, hand-rolled appetizers made from scratch. Thin strips of homemade biscuit dough were wrapped tightly around small cocktail sausages or Vienna sausages, pressed to seal at the seam, arranged on a baking sheet, and baked until the dough turned pale gold and the sausage inside had swelled slightly against its wrapping. They were served immediately, hot, compact, 2 bites each, on trays lined with paper napkins. Vintage in archives documenting 1950s Betty Crocker party recipes describe Pigs in a Blanket as a guaranteed crowd favorite and a non-negotiable staple of the era's cocktail spread. The 1950s cocktail party was itself an art form, a carefully staged domestic performance in which the food was as important as the conversation. Betty Crocker provided the complete script for that performance, appetizer by appetizer. The frozen supermarket version eventually replaced the handmade original so completely that most people today have no idea a scratch version ever existed. Part 14. Cheese Sandwich Loaf. The cheese sandwich loaf is the recipe that stops people cold when they first encounter it in a vintage Betty Crocker collection, and it stopped at least one reader of the Lost Recipes book so completely that she specifically mentioned it by name in her published review. The construction was theatrical. An entire loaf of sandwich bread was sliced horizontally into 4 or 5 layers. Each layer received a different filling: egg salad on one level, ham salad on another, cream cheese with cucumbers on the next, watercress and butter on the last. The layers were stacked back together, pressed firmly into their original loaf shape, and then the entire exterior was frosted like a birthday cake, covered completely in a thick layer of softened cream cheese, spread smooth with a spatula, and decorated with olive slices, pimiento strips, or fresh herb garnishes. It was refrigerated for several hours until firm enough to slice cleanly at the table. When cut, it revealed a cross-section of colorful, layered fillings. It was served at ladies' luncheons and afternoon teas throughout the 1950s and early 1960s. One reader who encountered this recipe described being served it at exactly such a gathering, and finding it precisely as unusual as it sounds. Part 15. Hot German Potato Salad. Hot German potato salad is so very antique that its American origins trace directly to 19th century German immigrant communities in Pennsylvania and the Midwest, communities that carried this recipe across the Atlantic and cooked it in their new country for generations before Betty Crocker ever put it on a printed page. Unlike the cold, mayonnaise-based potato salad that dominates American summer tables today, the German version was served hot, dressed with a sharp vinegar and bacon fat sauce that soaked into the sliced potatoes while they were still warm from the pot. Betty Crocker documented this recipe in her Lost Recipes collection, recognizing it as part of the immigrant culinary heritage that shaped American home cooking in ways that mainstream cookbooks rarely acknowledged. The dressing was made by rendering bacon until crisp, removing the pieces, and cooking sliced onion in the drippings until soft. Cider vinegar, sugar, celery seed, and salt were whisked in and brought to a boil, then poured over warm sliced potatoes and tossed to coat. The bacon was crumbled back in at the end. It was served immediately, still steaming. The dish arrived in America with German immigrants. Betty Crocker preserved it. And then America forgot it anyway.